Good morning and a very warm welcome to all those watching this podcast. My name is Mukund Rajan and I'm Vice President of the Council of Management of the Forum of Free Enterprise. The Forum is a non-political and non-partisan organization. It was founded in 1956 by the late Mr. A.D. Schroff, the eminent industrialist and economist. Its principal objects include educating and creating awareness among the public on economic affairs and economic policies. And it has a particular focus on engaging with India's youth through various activities with the objective of building well-informed citizens. Today's podcast is the third in the Global Indian series hosted by the Forum of Free Enterprise. The series shines a light on the growing stature and influence of India in global markets and the work that people of Indian origin are doing in critical fields of human endeavor all around the world. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome our guest today, Ambassador Nirupama Rao, and we're going to be discussing geopolitical trends and Indian foreign policy. A few words about Ambassador Rao's very distinguished career. During her 4-decade-long diplomatic career, she was India's first woman spokesperson in the Ministry of External Affairs, the first Indian woman High Commissioner to Sri Lanka, and the first Indian woman ambassador to the People's Republic of China. She served as India's Foreign Secretary, after which she was appointed as India's ambassador to the United States. Welcome, Ambassador Rao. It's an honor to have you as our guest on this podcast.
Thank you so much, Mukund. A very good morning to you, and I'm really happy to be on the show.
Thank you so much. So my first question, Ambassador Rao, and just for our audience benefit, I'm going to go through maybe up to 8 or 9 questions, and then we'll have some time to throw it open to the audience as well. So if you have questions, please post them on the chat box. And I know some of the audience have already taken the trouble of sending us questions in advance, so I've made a list of those as well. So maybe the first 45 minutes will be conversation between us, and then we'll take questions. My first question to you, Ambassador Rao. We have many students who watch our podcast, and they are very inspired by our guests. So my first question to you is about what a career in the Indian Foreign Service is like, especially for women. And what were some of the highs for you during your time in the service?
Well, Mukund, it's been very rewarding representing India and, in fact, may I say, engaging in high-stakes diplomacy. I had a very fulfilling and action-packed career, and I would refer particularly to my postings in our neighborhood and heading our embassy in China. Now, when it comes to the position of women in the field of Indian diplomacy and the Foreign Service, that position has evolved significantly over the decades. Women have risen steadily in the ranks. We've handled sensitive, very sensitive portfolios, and we have led with confidence, headed key embassies and missions abroad, and we've handled hardcore strategic issues. We have been involved in policy making, indeed led many initiatives in the field, and in the process set new benchmarks, I would say, in foreign policy leadership and in reinforcing India's global presence. Now, being Foreign Secretary requires competence and commitment, and it's not just a question of gender. It requires resilience, it requires adaptability, plus a deep understanding of geopolitics. So this applies to men and women alike. There is no difference. But I would add that representation still has to grow for women in public service where India is concerned. And I hope that this will be an increasing trend in the future.
Terrific. I hope some of the young women watching this podcast will be inspired to take the civil service examinations and follow in your footsteps. And in fact, talking about benchmarks, you've written I think, an eminently readable and wonderfully well-researched book, The Fractured Himalaya, on the Tibet issue and the India-China conflict. I have it, in fact, next to me. I really enjoyed going through this book, and it really sets, I think, a benchmark in terms of the quality of research and the way you have put across the critical issues that have impacted these two countries. I would urge our audience to read your book if they've not already done so. And I'd like to say it puts into context the difficult decisions that India really had to make in the 1950s and 1960s, a former colony that was struggling economically and yet trying to establish its leadership and a high moral stature within the international community. And your book, if I may say so, reminds us how important it is to read our own history and to remind ourselves of the special context in which our leaders have had to operate in the past and the difficult decisions they've had to make from time to time. So I'm going to ask you a question. When you look at the broad sweep of the history of the past 75 plus years of India-China relations, has much really changed in terms of the worldview of both countries and how they view each other? And it seems as if, just as you recounted the situation in the 50s and 60s, you have still two countries that want to establish their credentials as leaders of the developing world, the global south, and yet there continues to be considerable mistrust between them. What are your views about the worldview of both these countries and where things could potentially be headed in the next few years?
I think that's a great question. But first, thank you for your warm and generous comments on the book. I really appreciate that. Now, when you look at the broad sweep of India-China relations over the past 75 years, I think we have to recognize that there are striking continuities in this relationship, but also significant shifts. Strategic competition and, unfortunately, mistrust are givens over the whole expanse of this history. Even in the 50s and the 60s, we were vying for leadership in a post-colonial world. And our mutual mistrust emerged quite early in the relationship, with happenings in Tibet, for instance, and differences over the question of the boundary. We all know, our viewers know, that this is an unresolved question till this date. And that mistrust between the two sides intensified after the brief conflict of 1962, which was and remains a significant watershed in the relationship. Now, despite the phase of rapprochement from the late 1980s until 2020, you can call it, the 30 years of fairly stable relations, the events at Galwan in June of 2020 have only worsened relations and deepened strategic mistrust. This is despite the disengagement that has taken place in Eastern Ladakh, may I add. Mm-hmm. Now, today, both our countries want to lead in the global south. China through the Belt and Road Initiative and its economic power and influence, which we all would concede are considerable. And as far as India is concerned, through our various development assistance initiatives, the Voice of the Global South Summit, for instance, our presidency of the G20, our own discourse power, as it were. But the boundary is a continuing source of tension, despite, as I said, the disengagement in Eastern Ladakh. China's assertiveness, its muscularity on the line of actual control, one would even call it perhaps aggression in certain sectors of the border, remains a constant source of potentially kinetic tension, necessitating our own countermeasures from the military and security point of view in our border areas. Furthermore, the huge imbalance in our bilateral trade, and this is something that didn't prevail in the 60s after the war. We could cut off relations altogether, sever them, diplomatic relations at the ambassadorial level. But today, it's very different. We trade with each other, and there is a huge imbalance of trade that India has with China, and that has continued despite the events in Galwan. We haven't been able to do away with that. That kind of, perhaps you can call it decoupling, de-risking, whatever the terms may be, that has really not happened. And this has intensified the asymmetries in power and capacity between our nations. So despite our attempts to reduce dependence on China, banning Chinese apps, restricting investments, diversifying supply chains, the situation really has not improved to our advantage. So as I said, the biggest constant today is the trust deficit in the relationship. And I believe on the Chinese side, let me be candid, there is a lack of transparency in approach, which keeps our relationship fragile. And fundamental challenges therefore remain. And the current widening gap in strategic trust between China and the United States also impacts this relationship, even though we maintain our strategic autonomy. So the US sees India as a counterbalance to China. And this has, of course, led to our deepening defense, economic, and technological ties with the United States. So we stand to gain from that strategic alignment. But China is suspicious of our actions, and that is another source of tension. So, but let me be realistic, because all diplomacy today has to be realistic. We are not yet a complete substitute for the United States in terms of China's manufacturing ecosystem, and we must walk a fine line. So that is where our diplomacy is today. We continue to engage with China in multilateral forums, plurilateral forums like BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We've kept diplomatic channels open. And we have a multi-aligned approach, which avoids excessive dependence on the United States. But how do we navigate US-China tensions? Let us assume things go, really south in Taiwan. What is that going to entail in terms of our position, our reactions, the steps we take to safeguard ourselves? So these are all challenges that we face. And South Asia is also a battleground for us because China is vying for influence there. And our neighbors, our smaller neighbors, very often play the China card against us.
So it's a fraught relationship, and that's going to continue. I'm going to come back to that in a different manner after a couple of questions when we talk about the influence of President Trump's policies. But we will come back to that. There's much talk that these days we're all living in a multipolar world. And I know people who don't like that phrase, multipolar. But let me ask you, do you believe this to be the case? And if so, which are really the poles towards which countries are today gravitating?
Well, I definitely agree that we live in a multipolar world. Somebody called it a multiplex world. Many people entering and exiting. And the unipolar dominance of the United States post-Cold War is clearly under stress and frayed, although America is still what I would call a central power, in geopolitics today and the world today. China has risen to preeminence, we all know that, as far as the rest of the world is concerned, and is a formidable global player challenging US supremacy. So these are two poles I've referred to. The European Union is another pole of economic power and diplomatic influence, despite the war in Ukraine. Russia continues to be a key actor because of its military strength and strategic moves in global geopolitics. And India, of course, has emerged as a major economy, and our strategic footprint has also grown in significant measure, and this makes us a significant global player. Japan, with its leading economy status and advanced technological capabilities, is also a key influencer in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific. Now, I'd just like to bring to the notice of our viewers that in a recent interview, the new US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, acknowledged this shift, to a multipolar global configuration when he said, and I quote, "It's not normal for the world to have a unipolar power." That was an anomaly, and this is coming from the United States, mind you. It was a product of the end of the Cold War, but eventually you were going to reach back to a point where you had a multipolar world, multi-great powers, as he calls it, in different parts of the planet, unquote. Now, such a perspective from the new Trump administration does signal a potential shift in US foreign policy, moving away from post-World War II alliance frameworks towards a more flexible approach, acknowledging new configurations of diverse centers of global power. So this is really the multipolar world that you're talking of.
Right, fascinating. And I'm also struck by the fact that you mentioned all countries except for the European Union, which is like a trading bloc. And that brings me to my next question. There used to be a time when we used to talk about the non-aligned movement, and it used to seemingly have relevance and impact. These days, you hardly hear about it. So does non-alignment have any continuing relevance? Is it possible to remain non-aligned in a world that is multipolar, with countries choosing to otherwise align with one or the other pole?
Well, let me talk about India's situation today. A country like India has to navigate a complex web of relationships on the global stage. We have to balance cooperation and competition. I just spoke of the fierce rivalry that we have with China, although we do exercise prudence and self-restraint in what we do. So we have to avail of opportunities to assert our interests with more assertiveness, obviously, on the global stage. And the requirement is for nuanced diplomacy. Now, this is the world after non-alignment. Nuanced diplomacy, adaptive strategies to manage very intricate and complex dynamics in international relations today. So it's today, I think, not about non-alignment, but about issue-based alignments, right? Mm-hmm. Strategic partnerships with different global players. Now, you know our relationship with Russia, the United States, I can say as an example. The embrace of strategic autonomy, this independence of action, the exercise of an independent foreign policy, pragmatic, interest-based diplomacy. So we maintain a lot of flexibility in our decision-making. So non-alignment, to answer your question, has kind of evolved in a modern, realistic way, with us leveraging multiple relationships for our economic, our security, and our technological gains.
Got it. So it seems as if some of what you're saying sort of resonates with what our foreign minister, Dr. Jaishankar, has also said. He speaks of the current flux in, world in flux, and therefore there are potentially opportunities for those who may not be fully invested in the world order that was created after the Second World War. And he's expressed the need for realism in our foreign policy, and particularly in the context of the West and the United States adopting stances that are not anti-West, but could be potentially non-West. So I'm sensing that you sort of tend to agree that perhaps the space for idealism and a moral sort of perspective on what the world order should be is long past, and now you have to essentially be quite realistic about the world as it's taking shape, and be flexible in your approach. Is that something you would tend to agree with?
Yes, I recall, somebody saying once a few years ago that diplomacy is life without maps. Really, we are basically, in some senses, flying blind, although that may not be an apposite phrase. But let me just say that we don't really have pre-drawn maps that can guide us. And it's never been more so than today when I talk of this. And I believe Foreign Minister Jaishankar's views are certainly relevant because we must leverage our strengths, definitely, and practice realism, pragmatic diplomacy, which aligns with the evolving nature of global politics today. We have to keep our eyes and ears open. We have to listen, and we also have to act, and we have to be proactive, in fact. So we have to carve out, obviously, greater strategic space for ourselves. That is obviously our aim. And let me put it this way. This requires a cocktail of unabashed opportunism and self-interest with a good infusion of principle. I mean, it's not that we're abandoning our values and principles. After all, we are the world's largest democracy, and we have values to uphold. And we are a civilizational state. So That also is a matrix we cannot ignore. So, but we of course avoid recklessness and unnecessary entanglements. That is certainly one of our goals. And we engage with all, adapt constantly, and we prioritize self-interest. And this can apply to every country, I believe, when it comes to foreign policy. We seek opportunities in uncertainty, and we try to navigate great power rivalries without rigid alignment with either. That really is our position.
Got it. So you talked about there being still some role for principle. And, one of the things you often hear about in India's context particularly is soft power. India is expected to command some international influence through soft power, message through its prominence in things like yoga, Ayurveda, spirituality, the quest for morality, the legacy of Mahatma Gandhi, nonviolence, all of that. So question to you, in today's day, does soft power really work, or is there no substitute to hard power achieved through military and economic strength?
So all of us are aware of the debate between hard power and soft power. And to strike a lighter note, like love and marriage, they go together essentially, hard and soft power. So hard power is the decisive component in global geopolitics today, as it has been. But soft power, and how do you define soft power? It's the ability to persuade, to shape global narratives with the strength of your discourse power and credibility, the credibility you enjoy in terms of your standing among nations, that the fact that you're a responsible power. And that plays a critical role too, because it generates long-term influence. So you have to keep that in mind. And India is in many ways a soft powerhouse with our civilizational heritage, our ethos, our culture, our democracy, and our diaspora connections also. We must keep that in mind. But as we learn constantly from the world we are surrounded by, this is not adequate on its own without economic and military dominance or capability. Let me not use the word dominance. Soft power on its own does not translate into strategic influence. You have to keep that in mind. It creates goodwill, definitely, and it shapes global perceptions of ourselves. But to prevent our isolation, we must learn to convert our soft power into hard influence. For instance, leveraging Bollywood, Bollywood's reach to increase trade partnerships, or yoga diplomacy in order to strengthen ties with the West, or using our digital public infrastructure like UPI, or AI, or space technology, our vaccine diplomacy, to gain a leadership position in the global South. So the ideal balance is a combination of military and economic power, that is hard power, with soft power, culture, diplomacy, our democratic beliefs, the power of our example, as Sunil Khilnani would say, which together make for smart power, the combination of hard and soft power, equaling smart power.
Very well put. In fact, when you talked about the diaspora, I just wanted to mention that the very first episode in this Global Indian series was actually a conversation with M.R. Rangaswamy of Indiaspora and Sesha Iyer of BCG on the report they produced on the influence of Indians in the United States.
Yes.
Point well taken. My next question is really, I think, quite timely, and it's the context of Prime Minister's meeting later this week with President Trump in Washington. I saw a recent interview of yours where you said, America under Trump is not a benign power. It is quite competitive and even imperial. So what fears, Ambassador Rao, should we have about a Trump presidency for India? And equally, we all know he's a deal maker. What opportunities might we be presented, both this week when the Prime Minister is there, but also over the term of his presidency?
Referring to the adjective benign that you used at the start of your question, just this morning I was reading a piece by Martin Wolf in the Financial Times, where he said, till recently, the United States was a benign hegemon. A benign hegemon. And he's implying that that is not the case any longer if you are to read between the lines of what the new administration has been saying. For instance, Elon Musk has been speaking about, and he has done that, feeding US aid into a wood chipper, and so one wonders, what about the world's poorest people? I mean, you may argue that US aid was indulging in activities it should not have. I mean, I'm not the judge on this, but this is the kind of noise that has emanated from the US on the subject of American aid diplomacy. But, there are the poor and huddled masses that the Americans speak of always when they speak of liberty and, the land of sweet liberty that the United States is. There are the poor and huddled masses across the world, and the US was contributing about 40% of development aid for, underprivileged and marginalized people. So you can't feed them into the wood chipper, obviously. But anyway, so when it comes to India, you'll find a lot of people in Washington saying that India is a swing state, quote unquote. But be that as it may, many of our foreign policy practitioners, officials, bureaucrats, political figures, have personal and professional relationships with members of the new administration, the new US administration. Excuse me. So it is a robust relationship that India and the United States have, and it's something that various administrations and successive governments in New Delhi have contributed to. It has been a steadily evolving, upward-oriented relationship. And we, I believe, are well positioned to have a good equation with the Trump dispensation and to have the year of President Trump in whatever diplomatic sweepstakes he's going to announce. We'll have to see, of course, how, for instance, US policy plays out on Russia-India relations. We don't know what Mr. Trump has in mind. And I believe there are discussions ongoing with Russia about the Ukraine situation between Russia and the US. But as far as Russia-India relations are concerned, maybe it may be less of an irritation than it was during the Biden years. We'll have to see. But the US wants competing challengers to China in Asia, and India fits the bill as far as that goes. At the same time, an America first worldview in Washington has inbuilt presumptions about American primacy. Even if Marco Rubio says he understands it's a multipolar world, but this notion of American primacy, I don't believe has really gone away. That mindset is obviously there. And in such a view, it is America versus China that is a constant. And in such a context, there may be questions about India's strategic autonomy, for instance, and why we have not pledged our allegiance to US interests everywhere. Now, I'm not sure whether, we will be able to completely comply with that kind of a demand or requirement. But my hunch is that the government of India and Mr. Modi will be careful to avoid false steps with the new Trump administration, at least initially. So this is in the context of the visit, Mr. Modi's working visit to Washington. The challenges, if you ask me, will be tensions over trade. Mr. Trump wants a fairer trade relationship, as he calls it. He wants India to reduce tariffs and increase imports of American products, particularly defense equipment. Furthermore, immigration policies and potential restrictions on H-1B visas may be a source of strain. And of course, as I said earlier, the US pressuring India to align with its foreign policy objectives. The opportunities are, of course, defense cooperation, energy partnerships, because, importing more natural gas, for instance, from the US, and are working together to counter China's rising influence in the Indo-Pacific, where, as I said, the US views India as a pivotal partner.
You talked about possible impact on India's strategic autonomy. We've seen President Trump being critical of the suggestion that BRICS countries, for instance, might try and develop a common currency. And the BRICS formation has been another one where India has sort of seemed to be trying to, just create optionality for itself. So two questions really. One, what was the challenge that President Trump actually saw with a currency for the BRICS formation? Did he realistically think that is something imminent? And second, more generally about BRICS itself, does that really offer India optionality? What do you see as the relevance of BRICS going forward?
Well, I talked about, multilateralism and the new conglomerations that have emerged on the world scene. And BRICS is one of them. And, when you talk of a voice for the global South, there is a lot that organizations like BRICS can do. When you speak of the United States withdrawing from the WHO, for instance, there have been a number of people advocating that this, while this is unfortunate because the extent of US's support for global health was extremely critical and significant, but now that that has happened, this may be a time to introspect and to review what we can do to address the situation. So there's been a call that countries of the global South and India as a leader can really launch initiatives to increase our contributions to WHO, to come up with strategies to address, the lacunae in global health policy today. So these are opportunities, Similarly, with the dismantling of US aid, some analysts have spoken about how this should be an opportunity on addressing poverty alleviation for the rest of the world. There is a new multipolar multilateralism that we need on these issues. Now, as far as the dollar is concerned, and what Mr. Trump has been talking about potential challenges to the US dollar's dominance as the world's primary reserve currency are concerned, we all know that American geopolitical leverage derives in a very big way from the dollar's central role in global trade and finance. And the BRICS nations, and this is probably what Mr. Trump is looking at, represent a substantial part of the global GDP and population today. And the organization, that is BRICS, seeks to enhance the representation and influence of emerging economies in global institutions. And these countries want to reduce dependence on Western markets and strengthen trade and investment ties among themselves. You may argue, what is the alternative, given, the fragmented geopolitical situation that we confront? Now, there have been discussions about a common BRICS currency, but these seem to be nowhere near fruition. So that is really where this matter lies. BRICS nations, of course, that trade among themselves have sought to establish alternative payment systems to the dollar. But that is not a concerted move towards de-dollarization, I would say, because the US dollar accounts for 88% of global currency exchange, according to the Atlantic Council in Washington, and 59% of global currency reserves. So you see where we are.
Right.
And at the same time, of course, 1/5 of global trade was conducted in non-dollar currencies in 2023. So BRICS countries are increasingly trading in their national currencies between each other. For instance, Russia and China settled their trade in rubles and yuan today. We know that. And US sanctions on Russia and Iran maybe are a reason for China to seek such financial independence from the dollar. But of course, China has its own, aspirations and ideas and vision, if you can call it that, about world dominance. So I'm trying to give you a picture. It's a mixed picture. But perhaps Mr. Trump, by calling out the BRICS, is of course issuing a warning. But I really don't know if the situation really warrants such a warning at the moment.
And do you think it's potentially also a preemptive move to sort of, as you said, threaten or warn India and China from working more closely together, if at all that were possible in the near future, as countries that could potentially be commonly impacted by, the unsettling effect that some of the Trump actions are having on global trade?
Well, with Mr. Trump, you never know. Diplomatically, his mind is an ocean. We don't know. I mean, this manthan that is continually taking place, this churning, you never
Right.
know what it's going to throw up. Every day is a new day.
So you talked about multilateralism, and a quick question on whether the United Nations uh, continues to have a salience and a relevance, particularly with issues like climate change now going out of the window as far as the Trump administration is concerned. And of course, the actions you spoke about with the WHO, also the recent response to some of the actions of the International Court of Justice. Uh, multilateralism does seem to be under threat. Uh, what is the role of the UN, and what do you think India should be doing to either support or strengthen the cause of multilateralism, if at all?
Well, I don't believe the time has come for us to give up our belief and our convictions about the work of the United Nations. I mean, leave aside the Security Council and the gridlock that you see there on a daily basis. But, the development work that the United Nations has done over the years, the kind of contributions it has made to world progress and development cannot be denied and cannot be set aside. So I see a lot of relevance for the United Nations in the future also. But let me add that multilateralism is encountering very strong headwinds today. And you see it from the new Trump administration. You may argue that it's a victim of polarization within the United States itself, or that it's caught up in rising great power competition, or the trend, and this you have to, underscore that, a trend towards unilateral actions by many major powers that are diametrically opposed, even though they are, shouting from the rooftops about adherence to a rules-based international order, their actions belie that. So bypassing international institutions when decisions do not align with your interest is the kind of repetitive behavior of these major powers. I think we have to, keep that in perspective. Further, the UN Security Council is crying out for reform, and the structure remains unchanged. The post-World War II order has not changed, despite all the, transformations you see on the global scene. And economic protectionism and trade wars have virtually rendered the World Trade Organization weak and ineffective, because resorting to unilateral tariffs and sanctions has become the currency of the realm for powerful countries. But as I said at the outset, this cannot be the end of multilateralism, because all of us in the global community have a stake. And that's how you have, organizations like BRICS, the G20, and even, if you look at the Western side of the account, the Quad, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. All these are indications that there is multipolar multilateralism, as I said today. Perhaps it's not so much Western-centered multilateralism. And, when you talk of digital economy, AI governance, cybersecurity, supply chains, climate finance, these are all issues where you need multilateral cooperation, and therefore also more representation for the global South. Now, let me take the example of India. It played a very major role in the establishment of the International Solar Alliance, again, a multilateral grouping. So you drove an initiative outside traditional Western-dominated structures of multilateralism. So, there is a way forward on this. Global health cooperation, I talked about, involving the global South with India's encouragement. And this is an opportunity for our foreign policy mandarins. After the US withdrawal from the WHO is another area where we must get to work. Similarly, the US withdrawal from other multilateral institutions should spur us to build new structures of cooperation for development finance, debt relief, and I talked about digital infrastructure. So maybe this is a new inflection point for the global community, and that multilateralism needs a reset.
Excellent. Thank you. My next question is a little bit of future gazing, perhaps I'm requesting you to do. So I'm harking back to some of the comments you made in your book also about, the Bandung Conference, the fact that in the 1950s, so many countries had just emerged from colonial rule. There's a lot of hope and optimism about the future. These days, however, when you open the papers, whether it is war, trade, tariffs, you name it, there's a lot of anxiety, fear about the future. Is there anything that you're seeing as signs of hope that could potentially restore optimism, particularly for young people, about the future that governments could possibly do or India could lead?
Well, the Bandung Conference of 1955, it really did mark a moment of great hope and optimism for a newly decolonizing world. And these countries had hoped to shape their destinies outside the confines of the Cold War or superpower rivalry, and that optimism was stressing territorial integrity, sovereignty, non-aggression, peaceful coexistence. But that was an idealism and optimism, as you rightly pointed out, which did not last long because economic struggles intensified, inequalities deepened. There was the India-China conflict because both our countries were leaders of that movement. And as the world grew increasingly fragmented, the developing countries were marginalized in global governance. How do we restore that sense of optimism, to address your question? I think we need a redefinition of shared goals, of collective purpose. That's what is required today among all of us. And 21st century challenges like the technology gap, climate finance, global trade imbalances, they all stare us in the face. So cooperation within the Global South is also very much a part of this process. As I said, there's a lot of room for foreign policy initiatives in this regard, and India can be poised to be a global leader. And that this is what I call smart power. I spoke about smart power. We definitely have to lead, this campaign for a reform of global institutions. This has to become one of those points that we continually emphasize and act upon also with new initiatives, new ideas. And as I said, we have to rally people around this cause. Developing countries, for instance, cannot just be suppliers of raw materials to the rich world, but we have to develop our own manufacturing ecosystems. And that applies to all of us. Regional trading alliances have to be developed and consolidated. Now, debt traps have sucked in several countries from the Global South, and they've come under geopolitical pressures from the developed world. Countries like India, which is increasingly able to help, you look at the help we gave Sri Lanka when it faced its economic crisis a few years ago. We can be change makers in this regard. And we can be everything that China is not by virtue of our example, the example that we set. This is where I said, very pragmatic, but issue-based diplomacy can be practiced. So we can be leaders of the Global South, and we need leaders, in fact, who are cast in the mold of visionaries who led our countries in the Bandung area. And I'm talking of Jawaharlal Nehru, Kwame Nkrumah, Sukarno, Nasser, many more. I mean, this whole group, I'm not singling out just one person. And we have to invest in good governance, all of us, rising above, short-term political gains. So there's a combination of all this that is required. That's the secret sauce, I hope.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And in that same context, would you have a message for our young listeners? How invested should they be in understanding the world around us, not staying focused only on issues to do with India, but also the broader geopolitics, economic trends? And those who can, would you advise them to try and travel to other countries, including in our neighborhood, to see for themselves the life, the culture, the kind of social issues that are prevalent across the Global South?
Yeah, I think that is a key issue that you've raised, because I've always felt that young people, and I remember my own, years as a young person, I had this thirst for knowing what was going on in the outside world and learning also perhaps from what was happening there. So I really believe young people have to stay connected with the world outside and stay abreast of international trends, whether political, whether economic, whether cultural, whether it's energy related, or whether it's climate change related, for instance. We have to stay connected. In order to navigate the complexities of the world we live in, you need that kind of horizon building. And traveling abroad definitely widens perspectives. There's no doubt about it. It puts newer horizons before you, makes you more open-minded. Because I've always felt there's nothing more tragic than the tragedy of the closed mind. So you need open-mindedness, you need resilience, you need to be innovative, tolerant, adaptable. So you have to create, all of us, it's our responsibility perhaps as Indians, especially of an older generation, to create a new brand of citizenry which is globally literate. Globally literate. And travel enables you to see those things at first hand and not through hearsay. For example, understanding, why does Germany excel in manufacturing? There you understand. Why does Singapore lead in urban planning? Or how has Rwanda become a tech hub? How can you inspire solutions like that in our own neck of the woods? Right? So building a network of relationships across countries, personal network, can also help future personal development. It can help business opportunities, career opportunities. And you can also build social and economic intelligence through this process. Of course, not all of us can travel. We are a poor country, and there may be economic constraints. There are economic constraints for many of our young demographic. So I would suggest then tracking global economic, political, tech trends through Google News alerts, for instance. Everybody has a smartphone, has Wi-Fi connectivity, YouTube channels, Twitter or X discussions, or accessing sources in the electronic media like Channel News Asia, the BBC, Al Jazeera, WION, or our own newspapers like the Mint, the Indian Express, or the Hindu. And there's also the regional language press. I come from Kerala and we have such a vibrant Malayalam press. So you can also participate in online events like the UN Youth Assembly or the Harvard Model UN or the TEDx Global Summits, which allow remote participation. So, you can join LinkedIn groups or Reddit groups relating to international careers, take advantage of exchange programs, apply for them like the Fulbright or Chevening or Erasmus fellowships. And you can also explore remote work opportunities. So much is available today. So stay globally engaged is my advice to young people, to our young audience, because the world is moving towards multipolarity. And our young people have to be globally aware and become bridge builders, across these divides. And may I add, do contemplate a career in the Foreign Service.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Wonderful words of wisdom and terrific advice. I'm sure many of the youngsters will take that to heart. I have one final question for you, and then we're going to have a quick look at the questions from the audience. This is about a very interesting initiative you've launched in the space of music. So you and your husband, Sudhakar Rao, who's another, I must say for our audience, very distinguished civil servant, the two of them have set up a trust called the South Asian Symphony Foundation. So Ambassador Rao, this speaks to the idea of the uniting power of music, but I'd love for you to share with the audience a little bit more about your hopes from the establishment of this trust.
So our purpose, Mukund, in setting up this trust was to promote dialogue and mutual understanding and harmony, to begin with among the people of South Asia, between Indians and South Asians. I just talked about what our young people can do. So this is very much a youth-centered initiative. And it was also to connect people in India with the diaspora, the global community of persons of Indian and South Asian origin. We have a huge diaspora, as you know, running into millions across the surface of the earth. And this trust that we set up sees music, which I believe is a universal human right. Music as a medium in the creation of a South Asian identity that speaks to the rest of the world, and where India plays a leading role. And this is where soft power comes in, where we play a leading role at the level of ordinary citizens. There's no government involvement, ordinary citizens to promote the ideals of peace, non-violence. You spoke of Gandhiji, that India has stood for. So we've created this South Asian Symphony Orchestra, as we call it, of musicians drawn from across the world. And our concerts are called Peace Notes. In fact, it's become a trademark now. It's been registered as a trademark, Peace Notes.
Wonderful. Congratulations.
And, so I may just conclude by saying diplomacy, what is diplomacy? It is in essence about people. It is not some cold and sterile concept. It is about people, and we wish to unite people across borders. And may I add that a recent World Bank study of our foundation, they did a study, they called our orchestra a baton for cooperation. And a unique initiative by and for the people. So I'd like to add that.
Wonderful. Congratulations. Amazing initiative, and more power to you for that.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to now quickly run through a few questions. Maybe we can keep the responses quite crisp, and we'll certainly end within the hour. This first question is from Mr. Katoti, and he asks, what role can diplomacy play in addressing terrorism issues affecting the globe?
Well,
I guess he's talking a lot about cross-border issues as
absolutely.
well.
That continues to be an issue of continuing concern for India, because we have been victims. And yet again, I'm coming to the people. Our people have been victims of cross-border terrorism. And this has been a very, very big obstacle in our relationship. In fact, a critical obstacle in our relationship with Pakistan. And it has prevented dialogue and normalization of relations between our two countries. And this is something we have constantly emphasized to Pakistan. And our approach to cross-border terrorism is, across the board. It applies to any situation anywhere in the world. We have been champions about leading the world community in fighting this scourge and offering resistance to it. And our efforts continue to ensure that the United Nations comes up with a comprehensive convention against terrorism. And we have still not achieved that goal, but that doesn't mean we have given up on it. So to answer the questioner, the question of terrorism and counter-terrorism is very much a pillar of our foreign policy and all the efforts that we make for a more peaceful world oriented towards development. That is what people need. People do not need violence. People do not need conflict. People definitely say a vociferous no to terrorism.
Thank you. This next question is from Colonel Dilip Sopori. What are the reasons for India's hesitation to openly include defense cooperation with other members of the Quad? The reasons for forming the Quad are quite obvious in any case.
I'm not sure I really understand that, because as far as our Quad partners are concerned, United States, Japan, Australia, we engage in joint military exercises. There is a lot of defense cooperation, communication. There are partnerships in critical and emerging technologies. And the extent of cooperation in the Indo-Pacific and defense and security areas through the Quad partnerships. Let me add, of course, Quad does look at other areas also: development cooperation, disaster relief, humanitarian assistance, digital partnerships, health and vaccine diplomacy. There are a number of areas, space technology cooperation, but defense and security are very much also an intrinsic part of what we do in Quad. And India has been quite forward-looking in its approach to such cooperation. You know the history of the Quad. It was set up in 2007. It really emanates from the cooperation after the Indian Ocean tsunami of December 2004. But somehow the initiative petered out by 2007, and it was revived during the first Trump administration, in 2017. And it has now revived itself. It has expanded the areas of mutual cooperation, and it is a very vibrant partnership today. And we are going to have a summit meeting of the Quad in New Delhi during this year, as you know.
This next question is from Geetanjali. She said, I'd like to hear the ambassador's views on global and regional action for climate change mitigation. Where is it any longer a priority for governments, corporates, or individuals?
Well, you probably, with your ESG background, could also perhaps answer this question. I think the whole issue of climate change, especially for developing countries, is a question of our survival and our future destiny and our progress and development. So this is not something we can afford to go slow on or to disregard, and it has to become an article of faith in what we do as policy practitioners, trying to build global cooperation on this. Now, I just spoke of the International Solar Alliance that India set up and the kind of emphasis that we have placed on renewables, on the proportion of renewables in our energy quotient, in our energy generation. We have consistently spoken about the need for climate finance for countries that are affected by climate change, and the need for the developed world to be able to contribute in significant measure to these situations, because we're all affected by the fallout of this. And I think the melting of our glaciers, look what's happening in the Arctic, for instance, that has become a scene of geopolitical rivalry. So, climate change also leads to the intensification of geopolitical rivalries and the possibility of conflict, refugee flows, all the disruptions you see around the world. So I really hope that the Western countries, and the United States as a leader there, is able to take a more composite, comprehensive, and holistic view of these issues. The United States has, under Mr. Trump's second presidency, has withdrawn from the Paris Climate Agreement. And that really, to my belief, jeopardizes, our prospects to assure that kind of multilateral coming together and cooperation to fight climate change.
I think we have time for one final question, though it's a very big question, but maybe just a short, pithy answer. This is from Nilesh Hunswadkar. He says, can you explain the impact of the tariff actions of the United States, current and intended, with regard to the major economic blocs? And what is the world economic order going to look like in 4 years' time?
I'm sorry I didn't bring a crystal ball to this discussion. But let me say that with this emphasis on tariffs that Mr. Trump speaks about, tariff being the most beautiful word in the dictionary, and he has constantly something new. I mean, he's, even where alliances are concerned. In fact, today, the way the US is looking at alliances, is very different from the way it looked at them post-Cold War. It's more like, do you want to create tributaries rather than alliance partners? One doesn't know. These questions have to be answered. But Canada and Mexico were targeted, as you know, that has been put on hold for some time. We really don't know how and which direction all this is going to take. But what I can say is that the process of globalization and free and fair trade on which the WTO was built in the last 3 decades, that is all being threatened at the roots, as it were. And that is why I spoke about regional trading alliances, about everybody is going to make their own deals on these issues. There will have to be give and take. Obviously, there'll be a lot of hard negotiation involved. But my own impression of President Trump is that he is open to negotiation. It's not that, he makes these announcements and that is the be all and end all. I think he's waiting for responses. He's waiting for negotiation. He's waiting to make a deal.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So we're going to have to bring this podcast, unfortunately, to a close. We are on the hour. I want to mention to everyone that the recording is, in fact, available on YouTube as part of the Forum of Free Enterprises YouTube channel. So if there's anyone you think would be interested in this, may have missed this, or indeed other forum podcasts as part of our Global Indian series, do refer them to the YouTube recordings. With that, I'm going to thank Ambassador Rao for a wonderful interaction. You were extremely candid, very forthright with your advice, your opinions, your views. You shared your perspectives. And this is clearly informed richly with your many decades of foreign policy experience. So thank you so much. This was really wonderful to have you on the podcast. And also, of course, thank you to our audience for their interest and participation. We hope to see them back for more of our podcasts. And thank you also to Swati and the forum team and to our webcast partners, 24 Frames Digital, for all your hard work and all the arrangements for this podcast. Thank you once again,
Thank you so
Rao.
much. Thank you,
so much.
Mukund, and thank you to the team
Thank
and
you.
also to our listeners.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.